Today, we have with us Miguel Lorenco Pereira, a brilliant football historian and storyteller whose works dive deep into the culture, passion, and soul of the beautiful game. After his widely acclaimed book, Bring Me That Horizon, a study of Portuguese football, Miguel now takes us into the heart of Spain with his latest book, Passion, a journey to the soul of Spanish football. Miguel, welcome. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us.
No, I am absolutely honored to be here and to share with you our common passion with sports, with football in this case, and with books as well. So for me, it's great to be here and chat alongside you about the book and about whatever football touches us as human beings in society.
My first question is to you that what first sparked your love for writing about football in such a cultural and historical way?
Well, I'm always been a fan of history. My father was a history teacher, so ever since I was a little kid, I always wanted to know the world and to study the world, not only my country, Portugal, but all Europe, and then of course all the planet. So I've been reading thousands literally of books, not only about sports but history, economics, culture, to get a sense of how the world works. And then I understood that probably during the 20th century, football, a little bit like cinema, has become probably the most important social paradigm of what society was in most of the countries. Of course, there are countries where football is not as important as others. It happens with America. Cricket is so big in India, and then you have some other nations like China or Australia that football didn't kick off like it did. But especially in Europe, South America, Central America, even Africa, football was probably a great reflection of how the countries were, about how people thought, felt, how the economy works, how the culture works. So I started to understand that we could tell the story of the countries, of the continents, of the people throughout football, and use a mix of books that tell stories about the game, about matches, about players, about managers, about clubs, but also that tell stories about how the country was in the past, how it is now, and what we can expect for the near future.
After Bring Me That Horizon, why was Spain the natural chapter for you?
Well, basically because although I'm born in Portugal, I lived in Madrid since I was 22. I'm now 40, so probably half my life I spent in Spain. I'm half Spanish by heart, so I know the country inside out. I've traveled all around the country. I've seen football matches in different places. I've met different people, and I understood that it's also a country that is very complex, especially within the structures, the social political structures of Europe is probably one of the most complex nations there are. And those football stories help to understand what Spain is all about, not only for the people in Spain, but people outside of Spain that don't know a lot of the country, a lot of its culture, a lot of the characteristics that define different regions. So I took advantage of my knowledge of how the country was to just follow on the road. And when I finished the book about Portugal, it's simply to cross one border. So I imagine metaphorically that I would just pick up the car, cross the border, and keep on traveling until I ended up the journey to tell the book as it is.
The word passion captures so much culture, intensity, identity. What does passion really mean in Spanish football, according to you?
Well, I think not only in Spanish football, in Spanish society, passion is what drives people. It is a country that is much more intense emotionally than it is rational. So I think it's a nation where feelings, emotions are really up in the air. So essentially, if you want to understand political processes, if you want to understand how players play the game, how supporters expect players to behave, how clubs are run, you always go back to the emotion side of football, more to the rational side, or the that you can find more in Britain or in Germany or in other countries. So in the end, like bullfighting, like how they conduct themselves politically, the idea of you have to be really intoned with that passionate spirit to live it to the fullest is what defines Spain as a nation and also as a football nation. So I thought it would be a good word to describe what the book was all about in the cover.
Celta Vigo have never won a major trophy, so yet their fans remain fiercely devoted. Do you think suffering has shaped the club's identity as much as success has shaped Real Madrid or Barcelona or maybe Atletico?
Definitely. And we have to remember that even clubs as big as Real Madrid There were parts of their history where they weren't successful. Real Madrid spent 18 years without winning a league title, and they still were able to put 100,000 people in the stadium because people really do want to win. And of course, a lot of the people that support Barcelona and Real Madrid, they support them because they are winners and they want to enjoy the process of winning. We have to think that football for some people is like a comfort, an emotional comfort. So if you support a winner and your team wins, you feel good with yourself, and your week could have been rubbish. You could have issues with your work, with your family, but then football comes in, gives you a joy. So people enjoy that experience in football. That's why Madrid and Barcelona are so big. But then again, there's also the communal experience that going with the football with your friends, with your family, experience having drinks before or after matches. And those things don't depend if you win or if you lose. The experience of going is what counts. So that's why most of the clubs in Spain who haven't won anything, and like you mentioned, only Barcelona and Madrid won the Champions League, for instance. Not even Atletico Madrid or Valencia did. Betis is a club that hasn't won a European competition. Athletic Club Bilbao neither. They have recently won the cup, but for the first time in many years. And people really enjoy that moment. And probably they enjoy it more because they know that they will probably have to wait another 10, 15, 20 years to win it again. And that makes every single trophy won special. While if you are in a serial winner club, you enjoy winning the league, you enjoy winning the cup, you eventually enjoy more winning the Champions League, but you know it will happen again in your lifetime. So you give that for granted. And I think those clubs get their fan bases, understand that win or lose, the important is to belong to something more bigger than yourself.
You call Diego Aspas the Prince of the Betis. So, beyond his goals, what makes him such a mythical figure for Celta Vigo?
Well, essentially because he's a homegrown player, and in Galicia that is very important because throughout the history, football has in Galicia provided very good players. I would say that two of the biggest players in Spain, which was Luis Suarez, the first Spanish to win the Ballon d'Or in '60, and then Amancio Mario was a very big player for Real Madrid in the '60s and '70s. They were born in Galicia, but they were forced to leave Galicia very early to go and play for Real Madrid and Barcelona. Whether Iago, despite he had 2 years in Liverpool, he came back to his own club. He could have signed with whatever club. He could have been a Real Madrid player, he could have been an Atletico player, but he decided that he wanted to go home. He wanted to be near his family, near his friends, help young kids from the academy to grow up alongside him. And that made him really important because people understood that they have a quality player there for the bigger part of his career who could have made fortunes going for Saudi Arabia, for instance, or whether the reality that sport would give him more money than it did. But then he decided to stay. And for people, that sense of belongingness, when it's expressed also by a footballer that we now know are professionals, are there for the money, are there for getting their families financial security, to be so connected with the club that you also support as a kid, it's very important. That's why it resonates so much that even Deportivo rivals really respect him because they understand how important it is to have those kinds of players in your club, especially in this modern world where players usually don't are 3 or 4 seasons in a single football club without moving just to get a little bit more money.
June 30, 1992, a date you call the day Spanish football lost its soul. So, why does that day still matter today, 3 decades later?
Yeah, it matters a lot because Spanish football, contrary to what happens in the north, especially in the UK, was a club member based football. So football clubs existed as associations where the owners were the club members. They would pay a fee and then they would have a say on how the club was run. Every 3 or 4 years, they would elect the club chairman. If they didn't like him, they would vote him out. So it was a very democratic process, even during Franco's dictatorship of 50 years. So that law came in at a moment where most of the clubs in Spain were highly indebted. They had spent more than they had, and the state decided that they were not going to be bailed out. They had to convert themselves into PLCs, float on the market, and then they had to be saved by owners who had to invest their own money to keep the clubs running. So, except for Barcelona, Real Madrid, Athletic Club, and Osasuna, who had their finances okay, and at the same time were so big politically that they didn't want to have something to do with having a foreign owner controlling them. All the other clubs were forced into PLCs. And that meant that much of those clubs suffered deeply because the owners that came in really didn't connect it with the community. Most of them invested, and when they saw they had no return, they simply abandoned the club. And a lot of important clubs in Spain until that moment throughout the last decades have spent years in the second tier, third tier, fourth tier, have disappeared altogether. Clubs like Valencia is in bankruptcy for almost a decade now because his owner from Indonesia doesn't want to invest. You have clubs like Salamanca Logroñés who were disbanded because they went bankrupt and then were reincarnated by the supporters because they wanted to support a local club. So they started a Phoenix club from the base of the football pyramid. He had lots of stories of things that went bad. And most of the stories went really bad. There are a few cases of clubs who got themselves a good owner. Villarreal probably is a good example because the owner who bought the club has really invested in the club, is connected with the community, invested with the youth academy, and they have been over the last 25 years a very sound club to be managed. But most of them weren't. So if that law hadn't been approved, probably as the clubs would keep on being club members, most of them would still be alive. Probably not with the money enough to compete at the highest level, but would still be here. And now we are in the world where basically clubs depend exclusively from foreign investment. Spain is not a rich country, despite having good industry and wealth, but they don't have a lot of people who are ready to invest millions in football. And now, if you want to compete at the highest level in football, you have to have a lot of millions. So they are very dependent on foreign investment. And if you are depending on foreign investment, you're depending on people who look at you as a business, not as a football club, not as an institution. They don't care about the fan base. They don't care about your history, your past. They just want to make a profit. They want to go to Champions League or European competitions. And if that doesn't happen, they will sell you out and they move on with their lives and buy another investment. So that creates a sense of detachment that never exists in Spanish football. Whether if you are a supporter from a British club, British clubs have always had owners. The difference is now that before they were local owners, local businessmen who had money, and now most of them are foreign owners, but they were owners nonetheless. So supporters were used to have owners. And in Spain, that thing changed the mentality of supporters. They had to adapt to the new world, and that caused a lot of stress, and most of the clubs suffered.
Valencia's golden era in the early 2000s felt like a dream and yet collapse came fast. Was that downfall inevitable given the political and economic climate, or was it mismanagement pure and simple?
I think it's a mix of both. There was mismanagement, of course. There was an investment in players at the beginning of 2000s that didn't pay back. So eventually, I think they overspent to keep on working as they did. They should have been able to win more, a couple of leagues or a couple of European trophies, and they didn't. So that didn't help. But I think it's a reflection of what happened in Valencia as a whole. Valencia was like a laboratory for a Spanish economy to flow in the 1990s with all the tourism coming in, with all the construction buildings taking a different shape to what was the coastline before. And when they had the bubble in 2008 explode and all that economic crisis that followed, Valencia was one of the worst places in Europe to be. So every single business around that area suffered greatly. And Valencia, the football club, belonged to a guy who was owner of a construction building. So it was the possible owner to have at that moment as well. So in a sense, they were victims of the political economical situation that drove into the crisis that we have lived. But at the same time, they didn't help themselves too much with the business they did with some of the players.
Do you think Valencia will rise again as a football club?
Well, to do so, they need to be sold to another owner. With this owner, time has proven that they will not be able to get bigger because he has shown no interest in to invest in the club. When he bought the club was on a very difficult situation, so it was a very cheap club to buy. And then, despite never being relegated, who it could have happened in a couple of seasons, but they still managed to stay in La Liga. There have been no investment whatsoever. So the club right now only exists to compete in La Liga and to survive. If they get a different owner, which will not be easy because he has said time and time again that he doesn't want to sell, that he's comfortable with the situation, then situations will probably change. For better or worse, we don't know, but it would change. But if they remain in the hands of Peter Lim and his family, Valencia's situation will stay as it is today.
If Terry Venables had won the European Cup in 1986, do you believe Johan Cruyff's revolution might never have happened?
Yeah, for sure. That's one of the those rolling door moments that football sometimes has. If Terry Venables would have won that European Cup, which was very likely that he would, for someone who was living at the time and remembers how favorites Barcelona was, nobody knew nothing about Steaua Bucharest. The final was played in Seville, so it was played in Spain. 90% of the stadium were Barcelona supporters. So with all those conditions, the normal thing would be Barcelona winning the final. And if they had won the final, Terry Venables would have been sacked. Barcelona would haven't been put in the situation they were. And Cruyff was just starting his coaching career, was manager for just 2 years in Ajax Amsterdam back in the day. He would probably wouldn't have been hired and given so much power as it did. But it turned out to be the best. Sometimes a defeat, people don't realize that take you to a better place. And in the case of Barcelona, it did because Cruyff transformed the club completely. And the Barcelona we know today is a product exclusively of Johan Cruyff. The club has more than 100 years old, but in reality, the club that we have enjoyed over the past years was born in the late 1980s.
You write about Johan Cruyff's planting the seeds for Barcelona identity. Do you think Barca today still lives by his philosophy, or has the club drifted away from the statistician and the other things?
I think if the club still is able to win competitions like they did last year, it's because of Cruyff's legacy still alive somewhere. They have had a lot of mistakes regarding how the board runs the club. So that part of the club, the way they are run, the salaries that were paid, the investments that were made, they were also a reflection of what was the Barcelona before Cruyff, a club that spent a lot of money and a lot of players that didn't work out. They have signed in the past players like Maradona, didn't work out. They signed players like Gary Lineker back in the day, didn't work out as well. Eventually, they even signed Ronaldo Nazario, that didn't work out for them as well. So Barcelona historically was used to buy players, hope they would save the day. They wouldn't, so they would just buy more. And that was the thing that Cruyff tried to stop when he came in. And I think if Barcelona now still able to compete, whether it's from Flick or Xavi or any other coach, is because of the work Barcelona has done with the youth setups, and that's all Cruyff. So whenever they go to the youth setups and they find a Lamine Yamal, or they find a Dani Olmo, or they find a Gavi, or they find a Kouarsi, or whatever other player they can go and find them, they are only there because of Cruyff. Because when Cruyff arrived, there was practically no academy youth setup in Barcelona. So the idea of playing from the same base from when they are 8 to 10 years old, the same way that the first team plays, that created an identity that still lives on, despite Cruyff not being in the club for so long. And if they are now able to keep on recruiting those sort of players, is that because that template remain, even if at the level of management they have done so many mistakes that could cost the club's financial equilibrium even more.
Do you think the football world will ever see a team like Pep's Barca again, or was that once in a lifetime harmony of genius?
Well, it will be hard because it was a mix of a lot of different things, and you usually have great coaches, or you have great players, or you have good teams, but the three things together at the same time, it's extremely difficult. So probably I think we see one of those every 30 years, 40 years. It depends on how much you rate the players or the managers. For instance, Milan Saki, they had great players, they had a very good manager, and they had a very good core team, but it lasted 2 years in the elite, and Barcelona lasted much more. So I think it will be very hard first to find another player like Messi, which is very extremely difficult. Then to find so many people as good as Xavi, Iniesta, Busquets, Dani Alves at the same time at the same club, and then you'd go and find a coach as good as Guardiola. The three at the same time, it will be extremely hard to find. And I say never because probably the people who saw back in the day play Pelé say there would never be another Pelé. Then the Maradona came, and they would say there will be another Maradona. Then Messi and Ronaldo came. People say the same. So eventually, in 20 years, there will be someone at the same level. Football repeats itself, but it will be extremely hard.
And you write that Johan Cruyff made Spain think football instead of just play football. If you had to summarize his greatest gift to Spanish football in one line, what would it be?
I think it was precisely the ability to remove the passion in a good sense. Because, as we mentioned before, Spanish football, Spanish society is all about passion, intensity. So you had to run a lot, you had to cover ground, you have to tackle, you have to do things for the crowd to understand that you are committed. And Cruyff came in and he said, no, we have to think more about the game. I don't need to run as much. I don't need to tackle as hard if I am well positioned, if I know where the ball is going to be, if I know where my fellow companion is going to be. So it brought a little sense of calmness to how the Spanish play. It reduced the tempo, it reduced the intensity, but at the same time allowed players to be more artistic, to have more space to develop their skills. And I think that was the change, the most important change in Spanish football. Because if you look at all the players that we now love and admire that come from Spain, whether are from Barcelona, but also if you think David Silva, for instance, who is a player from the Canary Islands, has nothing to do with Barcelona, but has the same philosophy. Whether you think about Cesc Fabregas, where you think about Xabi Alonso, you see players that know how to think the game, know how to meditate. When you think of Rodri now, so that thing came only when Cruyff arrived at Barcelona, because before Spanish footballers were all grit and intensity and didn't have the ability to show their huge talent. They had it, but they wouldn't show it.
In your opinion, was Spain's true turning point the Euro 2008, or did the seeds go much earlier with Cruyff's dream team and Guardiola's rise?
Well, I think it's, if you look about Spain, it's also a period when Spain changes as a nation, because they had lived so many years in dictatorship that in the late 1980s, there's a generation of people who was already born in democracy, or at least were very young when Franco died, so they didn't suffer the consequences of the dictatorship. So those people brought a different mentality to life. They were more open-minded. They were more connected with what was happening around the world, not closed-minded, and they were more ready to embrace the different challenges. And I think Guardiola represents that. And Cruyff saw that in Guardiola, someone who thought about the future of the game and wasn't blocked by all the things that came from the past that blocked so many good players before him. So I think that's why he's one of the best examples of transferring knowledge, but at the same time, how a different society allows you to express yourself differently as well, both on and off the pitch.
Barcelona, Real Madrid, Atletico Madrid, each club has its own identity. So, how much of Spain's national team success is due to these clubs shaping styles versus the national team itself?
Well, I think it was one of the reasons why Spain wasn't successful before, because I think until the early 2000s, when they really started to win, the national side would play differently depending on how clubs were performing at club level. So if Real Madrid was on the rise, they would try to play with the national side the way Real Madrid played. But then if Atletico was on the rise, they would shape and call more players from Atletico and they would play differently. Barcelona as well, Valencia, the Basque. So in a sense, they didn't have an identity, a national identity. They would try to adapt to what was good at each moment in time. And I think when the early 2000s came, people in the Spanish Federation understood that we have to create our own identity. It doesn't matter if the players are coming from Barcelona, Real Madrid, Atletico, the Basque Country, from outside. They have to adapt to an idea of play. That's how Luis Aragonés revolution was so important, because it picked up players from very different clubs and it said, we're going to play this way. Probably this way is more similar to what happens with Barcelona, yes. But at the same time, I know that you are from Real Madrid and you know how to play this way. I know you're from Atletico, you know how to play this way. If you play in the Premier League, you also know how to play this way. So we are going to play this way. That's why, in a sense, he had to take off from the national side players like Raul, who wanted to play their way. And he had to replace them by younger players like Fernando Torres, for instance, who was very important back in the day for Spain. And he brought a lot of players, Santi Cazorla, Cesc Fabregas, David Silva, players that really understood that new identity and they weren't attached to any single club. At the same time, a lot of talent from Spain started to play abroad. Until the 2000s, probably 90% of the Spanish internationals played in Spain. So they were very dependent on what was happening inside of La Liga. But then they started to move to the Premier League. Then you had Fabregas at Arsenal, you had Torres at Liverpool, you had players going to Man United, you had players going to Italy. So those players knew different realities, different worlds, and they brought it back with the national side. And that brought itself a different mentality. And they started to create a sense of friendship, a community spirit that helped them to start winning competitions since 2008 onwards.
Sevilla FC are kings of the European League. How do you explain their almost mythic relationship with this competition?
I think Seville found themselves in a situation where you can choose to be a small fish in a big pond or the big fish in a small pond. So, in a sense, they chosen the latter. And essentially, what they have is a really connection with the competition that when they started to win it during the 2000s, usually big teams from the bigger leagues didn't pay much attention to it. So they were really focused on the Champions League, because if you won the European League, you didn't get the extra seat on the Champions League that was later given. And when that finally happened, Seville already had a tradition in the competition. They really felt comfortable playing in there, more comfortable playing there than playing in the Champions League. So I think they really understood that if they wanted to keep winning trophies, it was much easier for them to compete on the European in the Europa League or in the Conference League than to play in the Champions League and just lose games. And I think the focus shifted through there, and the club really understood that they were very comfortable in that situation.
If Pep had never existed, where would modern football be today?
It will be a very different game. Very, very different game. I think it will be a more physical game than it is, in a sense that it will be a game more similar to what Mourinho represented. I think what Guardiola did, it changed the pattern. It changed the way the game was thought about, in terms of possession, in terms of how teams were creative in pitch. And it would probably have been a game much more similar to what Mourinho's Real Madrid was, because it was not a defensive team per se. They have the highest goals scored in a single season in Spain still today, but it was more of a counter-attacking team. And I think back in those days, if you didn't play football like Barcelona did, you usually play counter-attacking football and probably would be still locked in that dimension.
Aegis Castro's tragic death, rescuing two children, feels like folklore, almost too mythical to be true. Do you think modern football is built on these kind of legends?
Oh yeah, for sure. I think modern football needs legends more than ever, because the way sides are being run, how the game goes, how the extra doses of capitalism has been conditioning how the clubs, the competitions, the organizations are run. You need more than ever legends that represent something different. So, in that sense, I think it was very important to have that idea behind something bigger than life that represents football on a whole basis.
From Di Stefano to Cristiano Ronaldo to Jude Bellingham, are these players architects of eras or passengers on a ship that sails regardless?
Yeah, the ship sails regardless. I think time and time again, history has proven that Real Madrid is in a league of their own, especially regarding what Champions League is all about. They had been home to many iconic football players ever since Di Stefano got there in the 1950s. They have been home to a lot of great football managers, but they come, they go, they leave their legacy, they leave their imprint, they have their moments, but the club keeps on winning. And I think that's one of the things that makes Real Madrid so unique, because when you look to other great football clubs in history, their dominance goes to different generations. When if things work out okay, then you are competitive. You had that in Barcelona, you had that in Manchester United, you had that with Liverpool, you had that with AC Milan. And in Real Madrid, you never know when they're going to win, because it doesn't matter the generation, it doesn't matter who is there as a manager, who is there a player. In the end, they always manage to be competitive. And that killer instinct that they have, time and time again, proven, especially in Europe, has made them probably the most unique case. I would say that Brazil was similar in international football 10, 20 years ago, but then over the last 20 years, Brazil is not the Brazil that the people knew back in the day, or even Germany was a different nation what it is today. And Real Madrid, consistently since the 1950s, the ship keeps on sailing.
Florentino Perez is often painted as a supervillain or a savior of Madrid. After writing this book, where do you place him in the club's mythology?
I think Florentino is now as big as Santiago Bernabeu. I think he got to that dimension. I think the way Santiago Bernabeu is, like I said, the different generation also applies to him. If you come first, then what you do, it's more difficult, because the guys that came afterwards benefit from what you have done before. But I think Florentino, which has a lot of things that can be criticized, but at the same time, he did brought Real Madrid to the 21st century. And when he got to the club was indebted. They had a lot of issues, socially, economic, and then he revolutionized the club. He revolutionized how other clubs saw football. I think a lot of the templates of the football today come from him, which is also, in a way, a legacy that he leaves. You might like it more or not, but it is what it is. And in the sense that he has won so much and he has created now a new stadium, the same way that Bernabeu did back in the day. He is trying to create a new competition in the Super League, like Bernabeu did back in the day with the European Cup. So I think we can put them almost side by side in the club's mythology, and they are probably two of the three or four more important chairmen in the history of the football game worldwide.
Miguel, if in 20 years someone remembers this book with one lesson, what do you hope it will be?
Well, I hope it is a gateway to what Spain is, more than what just Spanish football is, what Spain is today. I don't know what Spain will have in 20 years. It will surely be different from the Spain today. The same thing that Spain today nothing has nothing to do with the Spain of 20 years ago when I arrived here. So I really want to be like a photo of what Spain is today. And people look to photos usually with a sense of nostalgia. They look to photos with a sense of, I didn't remember this was like this, or they look to photos saying, I do remember that moment. So I want it to be like a photograph of what Spain as a country, as a nation, as a football identity is today. Because if it will evolve, because it will surely will, then you can look back and have a testimony of what it was in the past. And some many times people usually forget the importance of looking back and see where we were until we have arrived at the moment that we are today. And sometimes having books, films, works of art, things that help you put on context of how the world was and how did we get where we did. It helps in a sense that gives you a sense of belonging and gives you a sense of evolution. And Spain will ever be a country that will evolve in something different, Spanish football as well. And I want Pasión to be a representative of that evolution, the one that happened until now, until 2025, so that people in 2045 can look back and say, see how much we have grown as a nation, or how much that country has evolved as a nation from the time that guy wrote that book. Because I remember the first time I read an excellent book, which is Morbo by Phil Ball. It was a book written 25 years ago. And if you read the book today, it's not the Spain of today. It was the Spain that Phil knew 25 years ago. So you read Pasión and read Morbo, and you see very different realities. It's the same nation, but it has evolved. So probably in 20 years, there will be much more better books than mine talking about different Spain. But they will have this one as a point of entrance to what it is the world in 2025.
Miguel, thank you so much for talking us through this journey into the passion and soul of Spanish football. It's been a pleasure having you here. Thank you once again, and all the best for the future.
Thank you so much for having me. It was an absolute pleasure to be here.